Good evening and welcome to the San Bruno City Council special meeting of June 11th at 5 o'clock here at the Senior Center. Call it to order, and if we can have roll call, please.
Councilmember Medina?
Here.
Councilmember Salazar?
Here.
Vice Mayor O'Connell? Here. Mayor Medina?
Here.
Councilmember Davis is excused with notice.
Thank you. Item 3, public comments on items not on the agenda. No speaker cards. Anybody from the audience? Not. We will move on to the reason that we're here for the special meeting is to conduct a study session to review the city manager's proposed fiscal year 2019-2020 operating and capital improvement program, CIP budget. City manager.
Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council members, and members of the public. So we are here holding our second meeting on the proposed budget. We have an agenda for you tonight that we'll show on the screen now, and that agenda is a welcome by me, so welcome, overview of our goals and objectives. We'll have some financial overview slides, so for the council and members of the public that either attended or have watched our budget retreat that was held on May 29th, a little bit of this intro summary will be a repeat, but we wanted to provide it to you again. And then we will talk about some of the action items from that retreat. So there were a number of questions from the City Council that we would like to provide answers to. And then the bulk of our presentation today is around the capital improvement known as the CIP budget for fiscal year 1920. We then want to give a presentation on our equipment and vehicles, our debt service, and then take any questions that the City Council will have. Following tonight's budget study session, the next meeting on the budget is scheduled to take place on June 25th at our regular meeting. And we did talk about initially, if needed, having another meeting, a special meeting if needed, in the week in between this week and the June 25th meeting. And so should council decide that that's necessary, we can schedule a special meeting if needed. So beginning with an introduction. So our goals for the last study session that we're continuing tonight is to receive the proposed budget, both the operating and capital, to understand the city's fiscal condition, receive update on our achievements, strategic initiatives, and challenges for each department, and we were able to accomplish that process on May 29th, and then ask questions, and so that's what we're here for. Another review on the organization's mission, vision, and values. So our mission statement is the City of San Bruno exists to provide exemplary services to the community that enhance and protect our quality of life. Our vision is San Bruno will be a peninsula city of choice in which to live, work, shop, and play. And so the budget that is before you is in line with both that vision, the mission statement, and our values. Also, as a quick reminder, this year the City Council on February 26, 2019, adopted 7 priority focus areas for the organization. Those priority focus areas are supported by over 100 strategic initiatives that this organization is making progress on in 2019, and we will have a mid-year report on those initiatives, as well as continue to keep the council abreast of our progress on the various items. And a lot of those items we talked about on the 29th because they make up some of the special projects that we're working on and really are supported through the budget that is before you. In addition, another reminder for the council and the community is that we do have fiscal challenges. This budget clearly highlights those. The other thing this budget does is that we make progress on our deficit, both in the current fiscal year 18-19, our estimated closing, but also in the proposed 19-20 budget, taking a deficit down from around $2 million to around $300,000. And so we can't accomplish it all in one year, but we make significant progress in the proposed budget that's before you, and that's something that I think we should all celebrate. And it's a testament to the status quo budgeting and the recognizing that there are some key areas where we need to increase our services and the service that we provide in maintaining our buildings and the assets and the services we provide to the community. And for the most part, it is a good news budget, but we still have challenges that we need to make, challenges that we need to accomplish over a multi-year, multi-pronged process, and that we have launched a project to do that. And so, as you know, we are really in the middle of a community-focused and transparent fiscal planning process, and we are engaging ourselves in community conversations to engage with the community, both in surveys. A recent mailer went out to every household in the city of San Bruno seeking their input on the priorities for city services. We have also launched a website called Enhancing Your San Bruno, where we provide information, frequently asked questions, and an online version of that survey. And we are soliciting feedback from residents on what their priorities. What we know thus far is that residents have cited a number of things, and this is in priority order from the first survey that was done, and that is increasing pothole and other street hazard repair, increasing street repair and maintenance, kind of our regular annual maintenance, maintaining street repair and our rehabilitation programs, maintaining neighborhood police patrols, attracting and maintaining local businesses, maintaining our parks and our playgrounds, and maintaining and repairing our park structures for our youth and children. And so this budget makes progress on that, but as we talked about and as you'll see in the capital budget, there's a lot that is left undone, and we are facing that challenge head on and working to address that over a multi-year process. And so now I'll turn it over to the Finance Director to go through some of our financial summaries.
Thank you, Javon. Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council. My name is Keith DiMartini. I'm the city's Finance Director. And so I'll be providing a brief overview of some of the slides that I presented to you a few weeks ago at our budget retreat on May 29th. Just a high-level overview of the general fund and the enterprise funds to provide context primarily for the capital improvement program, or the CIP budgeting, that we'll be going in some detail this evening. And so first, let me start with the city's general fund. And as an overview of a new approach to preparing the budget for fiscal year 2019-20, the city prepared and presented to council on May 29th a long-range financial plan for the general fund and for the 4 enterprise funds with the city. And preparing and presenting a long-range financial plan is important in regards to the budgeting process, because it's in line with our fiscally conservative and prudent practices, but it also provides not only 1 year of context, but context on an ongoing basis for some of the decisions that council will be making in this budget process. It also articulates many of the assumptions that we have on our major revenue sources, as well as ongoing some known cost increases as far as personnel expenses with fringe benefits or cost of living adjustments assumptions. And so with that, this slide here shows just a high-level overview of our current year estimate in fiscal year 18-19, what's being proposed in 19-20, and 4 fiscal years out to complete our 5-year financial planning cycle. The green line is our projected revenues in the general fund. The black dotted line is our projected expenditures, and the blue bar is the projected ending fund balance in each of those fiscal years. And so, as you can see, there is significant pressure in the general fund over the next 3 or 4 fiscal years as it relates to ensuring that we have adequate revenue coming into the general fund for what are known expenditures within that same period of time. It's worth noting here that this financial plan assumes current baseline service levels. There's no additional, staff proposed in the out years. It's conservative. It conservatively estimates the revenue sources and the expenditures for the revenue side between 3 to 6% for our major tax revenues, and for personnel. Cost increases as it relates to any cost of living adjustments or fringe pension cost increases, that's estimated around 5%. So you can see there are significant pressures in the general fund in the coming years that we will be having to make some decisions on. This slide here is just a high-level summary of the general fund in the current fiscal year and in the budget year as it relates to what our fund balances will be, beginning and end. It's really important to note here that, as the city manager indicated earlier, that there is some revenue growth that we will anticipate next fiscal year at around 8% in the general fund. And in the expenditures, we're really only projecting around 5% of expenditure growth. So that, in effect, has a positive impact on the ending fund balance in the general fund. We're projecting it to be a little over $2 million by the end of fiscal year 1920. And as the city manager indicated, we're projecting to just have a much smaller deficit in fiscal year 1920 of just over $370,000 in that year. This slide here just shows a high-level allocation of our general fund revenues, what our major revenue sources are, and our general fund expenditures. On the revenue side, a majority of the revenue coming into the general fund comes from taxes. The major tax revenues are property tax, sales tax, transient occupancy tax, and business license tax, among a few others. There are some departmental revenues, a majority of which comes from community services and our community and economic development department for development projects. On the expenditure side, you'll see a majority of the general fund sources go towards our public safety functions with police and fire primarily. And then you'll see all the other departments that receive general fund support during the year. So peeling the onion back one level, I wanted to just show you a slide of what our major revenue sources look like in the general fund in the current fiscal year, our amended budget versus actual, and the proposed budget for fiscal year 1920. And as I said earlier, our revenue picture in the general fund is strong. It is showing a projected increase of about 8% year over year when looking at budget to budget. Again, primarily, it's due to the increased property tax, sales tax, and other tax revenue sources in the general fund, with some fairly strong increase in some departmental revenues, primarily in the building department, with some anticipated additional volume of large building permit activity that the department will need to be reviewing in that time frame. As I presented on the 29th too, I just wanted to show a couple slides of what this slide here is the proportional share of property tax dollars that are remitted to the county, what share actually comes back to the city of San Bruno. For property tax, most of the revenue generated goes towards the public school systems in the area and the county itself. Only about 14 or 15% of all property tax dollars remitted come back to the city of San Bruno. And similarly, it's a very similar picture for sales tax revenue. Most sales tax revenue that's generated goes towards the state. It goes to the state's general fund. Only about 11% of every sales tax dollar transmitted within the city of San Bruno comes to the city of San Bruno to be used in our general fund. So it is a rather small percentage of the total amount of money collected for both major revenue sources for our general fund. Moving on to the expenditures. This slide here shows a high-level overview of the major functions that receive general funding in each fiscal year. And as I said earlier, there's about 5% expenditure increase that we're expecting in fiscal year 1920, primarily due to the increase for personnel expenses with fringe and pension increases citywide, as well as cost of living or CPI inflationary increases for a lot of our contracts, and any known increases with our service levels to meet service demand. This slide here lists the major impacts on the expenditure side that we have incorporated into our proposed fiscal year 1920 budget. That includes known MOU cost increases for police and fire, but there are MOU contracts that will be expiring within the fiscal year, and so that whatever happens with the negotiations with those contracts may be anticipated pressure. That's not currently budgeted in the 1920 budget. There are known rises to our pension costs, health and other insurance costs. There will be 2 elections that will occur within fiscal year 1920, the costs of which are substantial and have been incorporated into the budget. I mentioned our CPI on contracts. There is also a need to ensure that our IT infrastructure and our software applications that we use to run the city, we maintain them. We pay all of the service and maintenance costs, and there are a number of mandates that put pressure on making sure that we adhere to requirements such as ADA requirements for a lot of our facilities. So all of these costs, to the extent possible, we have incorporated them into our proposal, but not all of them are being met, which we will talk about as we get into the CIP budget. This slide here is a high level of our general fund reserves, which we presented a couple weeks ago. Overall, our reserves continue to be strong and to be maintained. The first line here is our general fund balance. The reserve policy, which Council adopted a number of years ago, sets a target for us to maintain a $1.5 million fund balance in the general fund. We have been able to achieve that in recent years, and we plan to achieve that again in the upcoming budget cycle. The city has a general fund reserve, which has a target of 25% of our annual operating expenditures within that reserve. So as our budget goes up, that reserve also needs to go up proportionately, and we are planning to meet the reserve requirement in the upcoming budget cycle. We also have a general fund capital reserve and a general fund emergency disaster reserve. In both of those funds, we are also planning on meeting those targets as well. So if I may, these next two slides, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about the general fund capital reserve. Again, to provide context as I present the CIP budget for fiscal year 1920. As I mentioned on the prior slide, we are planning on meeting the general fund capital reserve fund balance target of just over $5 billion in the upcoming fiscal year 1920 budget. However, as you'll see in the CIP budget, we do plan CIP projects in a 5-year time horizon. So you'll see expenditures all the way out through fiscal year 23-24. And if we were to implement all of the projects that have budget allocations planned through the 5-year period of time, we would very quickly run into a negative fund balance starting in fiscal year 2021. And so without any additional sources of revenue into our general fund capital reserve, we will not be able to implement all of the projects that we would like to in the CIP budget. And as we go through through those slides, we will identify the projects where they are either underfunded, don't have adequate funding, or there's no funding identified for them at all. So we will go through that in quite some detail. So as I said earlier, the capital improvement project, the general fund capital reserve, we will plan to meet the target, but we had to make some tough decisions to not include funding for certain projects that we would like to, so that we can maintain a healthy reserve in the fund in case there is a need to utilize that funding during the operating year. So with that, I'll turn it over to providing just again a really brief overview of the enterprise funds, the slides that we presented a couple weeks ago. Again, many of these enterprise funds, there are pretty significant planned capital improvement projects in that year. So I wanted to, again, just reiterate the impact on the funds when we implement those capital improvement projects. So first, I'd like to start with the water fund, our water enterprise fund. So here is the long-range financial plan for the water enterprise. And on the revenue side, we include the continuation of the 5% rate increases that the next one will take effect on July 1st of 2019. And there is another one that's planned 1 year after that. And from then on, I'm not projecting any additional rate increases in the 5-year financial forecast at this time. And we did make an assumption for additional capacity charges for bringing on new development projects. They pay a fee in order to hook up their utilities, and so I included an assumption for that in our revenue as well. On the expenditure side, it's the planned increases to our operating program for the water programs, as well as all of the planned water capital projects through the 5-year time horizon. So you'll see that there is a significant drop in the fund balance from current fiscal year all the way through into about 2021 because of the aggressive capital program that the water enterprise is planning on doing, but maintaining a fairly healthy fund balance within that fund of just between $10 to $15 million in fiscal year 2021. And so I don't have any concern at the moment of this plan because there is adequate fund balance in case of an emergency in the water enterprise. This slide here just shows a high-level summary of the beginning fund balances, the operating revenues and expenditures, and any debt proceeds and expenses that will occur in the fund, and what the ending fund balance will be. So again, starting with planned healthy fund balances at the beginning of the fiscal year, next fiscal year, we will have adequate revenues that come in to meet the operating expenditures, as I mentioned earlier, and with a pretty substantial capital improvement program, set of expenditures in fiscal year 1920 of just over $18 million, we will still maintain a fairly healthy fund balance at the end of the fiscal year in that fund. So moving on to the wastewater enterprise, the 5-year financial plan looks fairly similar to the water enterprise. Again, we include the rate increases that are already scheduled to occur on July 1st, and again a year later, with an assumption of water capacity charges as well for bringing development projects online. And again, a majority of the pressure that's occurring in that fund is from the planned capital improvement projects in fiscal year 1920 and beyond. And this slide again just shows a high-level summary of the wastewater enterprise, starting with a fund balance in fiscal year 1920 of just over $20 million, bringing in operating revenues of over $18 million, more than enough to cover the operating expenditures. But again, that surplus is then used to fund the major capital investments in the CIP program. And then the final enterprise fund that I'd like to present to you this evening is on our stormwater enterprise. And as I mentioned at our budget retreat on May 29th, the stormwater enterprise is very fastly approaching a negative fund balance. I mentioned that the only revenue source that goes into the stormwater enterprise fund is from the stormwater rate that's assessed on homeowners' annual property tax bills. And that's a rate of it's approximately $46.16 annually. And that does not generate enough revenue to sustain the required ongoing operations in the stormwater fund. And as you can see on this slide, each year in the current year, in the budget year, and in the forecast period, the expenditures exceed the revenues. And so on the graph below that, you'll see us dropping down to just a couple $100,000 fund balance in the budget year 1920, and then into a negative fund balance picture. And so it's important to understand the pressure in this fund, and we will need to identify dedicated additional resources to fund the ongoing operations, let alone capital improvements that are required in the stormwater system. And so that's something to consider when looking at the general fund and what fund balances we have in the general fund to potentially fund this ongoing need. And this slide here shows what the fund balances plan to be at the end of fiscal year 18-19 of just over $1.5 million. But again, not bringing in enough revenue of $679,000 to sustain the annual operating expenses of just over $1.2 million. So I'm anticipating a fund balance of just over $200,000 by the end of fiscal year 1920. And so with that, I'm ready to address some of the action items that Council had from the May 29th meeting, but should we pause for questions? Keep going, okay. So there were a number of questions and action items that were discussed from the retreat on May 29th, and so I wanted to provide just a high-level overview in response to many of Council's questions and action items that you had for us. So the first item was about general fund tax per capita comparison. I had showed a slide of what the city's general fund taxes per capita was compared to some of the other cities in San Mateo County, and there was a request to research what the city of Millbrae's tax per capita was. That data was not directly provided on the report that I had from the state controller's office, but I went to the city of Millbrae's website, calculated it myself from their fiscal year 18-19 adopted budget, and it came to just over around $1,300 per capita, $1,300 per capita. And San Bruno's per capita, as referenced, was just over $660. So it's a little bit more than double of what San Bruno's is what Millbrae's is. There was also a comment about providing some additional regional tax comparisons for maybe some additional, more specific metrics for property taxes, compared to maybe property tax sales or sales tax that's provided to the city compared to total sales tax revenue generated. That's not data that we currently have readily available from many of the peer cities in San Mateo County. We have it for San Bruno. And so that's something that I can work on with our sales and our property tax consultants to see if we can gather some additional data. And that's something I can present during maybe one of my quarterly financial update presentations, or maybe even during next year's budget cycle. So I'd be happy to look into that further. There was also a comment about potentially reviewing our reserve policy. And that's something that I think the city manager and I would like to do during the comprehensive fiscal sustainability project. That'll be something that we'll look at as it relates to this budget cycle, preparing for next budget cycle, and some of the other work going on in that project. There was also a request to report on fund balances during the year. There are staff reports that staff present to council requesting the need to use fund balance in various funds, the general fund, Measure A, gas tax. So we will plan to do that during fiscal year 1920 and beyond, so that council has an accurate picture of what the fund balances look like in the funds when we request you to take an action to appropriate funding in those funds. We will plan to do that. There was also a request from the city attorney and the city clerk's office to look at the agenda management system. There have been 2 demos that have already been conducted, and there is a plan to receive an additional 2 demos. Right now, that project is not budgeted in the fiscal year 1920 budget. If we were to do so, I recommend that we put a budget in there of about $30,000 if council wanted staff to go ahead and plan for that project. We could do that. That would be my recommendation at this time. There was also a request for including the police department's call volume. When we actually publish the adopted budget, we will go ahead and include that. The police chief has provided that information, and we will present that in the adopted budget. There was also a request to see what some of the allocations were from the county and the police department. And I have a long list of many of the allocations, so I don't know if I go through each one of them individually, but just to highlight some of the high dollar ones. The police department's annual operating budget includes just over $360,000 for animal control services, over $47,000 for our contribution to the animal control facility itself, around $23,000 for the crime lab. There's an additional $80,000 for the crime lab for usage fees. There's a $170,000 allocation for parking fines. There's $36,000 for the First Chance Sober Station. So there's a number of other ones, which I'd be happy to list all of them out if you'd like in a memo, but that's just a host of some of the allocations in the police department. There was also a discussion that occurred on May 29th about a concern for not having a dedicated allocation for fire mitigation. And just to reiterate, we currently do not have a direct allocation for that, but if council chose to request staff to include that in the adopted budget, we could go ahead and do that.
Yeah. Hi, I'll jump in real quick. On fire mitigation, we have an update that we can have the fire chief provide. I'll give a high-level summary of that, which is, as the city council know, you approved a no harm assessment that is currently being done. That no harm assessment is identifying the areas that are most prone to fires. Once that assessment is completed, we will know all of our risk areas and be able to prioritize them. In addition, the city is identifying mitigations that can occur in one of our highest risk areas, the Crestmore Canyon. We do not have funds allocated in the budget to do that. It is estimated that we need over $200,000 to do some of the underbrush clearing that needs to be done. We are currently getting bids for that. That is over the city manager's signature authority. And so once we get those bids, we can bring that to council for an allocation. We have a number of different mechanisms to start to chip away at that need. It is a long-standing need to do some clearing. We recently cleared the fire road, and we had a grant that we received for $16,000 to clear the fire road in the canyon, and we did that. And so we're continuing to make progress on ways to mitigate the issues there, and we will bring them back to council for an allocation once we have exact quotes on what to do.
Okay, so the few remaining action items from the May 29th budget retreat. There was a request to confirm the scope of the parking lot restriping at the senior center, whether or not it would include a slurry seal. And currently, the project as planned does not include doing that, so it just includes the cost of restriping the parking lot. There was also a request to see if staff would be able to pressure wash the exterior of the senior center, and staff are currently working on that, and I believe they are almost complete with pressure washing the exterior of the building. There was also a request to look into and reviewing the water and the wastewater rate increase assumptions that were included in the rate study that was conducted when the rates were set a few years back. I did review the report, and there were a number of assumptions that underlie the rate increases of 5% for 5 years. There was an assumption about planned development for residential projects of around, I believe, 25 per year, and I don't believe we've met that development target during the rate study period, and so it hasn't exceeded it, which means that the rates that are set are likely still okay, especially considering the aggressive capital improvement program projects that are planned within that time period, using the revenue from the rate increases for that purpose. There was also an assumption about retaining a fund balance within both the water and the wastewater funds. There is not, in the city's adopted reserve policy, it does not speak to the enterprise departments, the enterprise funds. It really primarily only speaks to the general fund and our internal service funds. It does not speak to the enterprise funds. But the rate study, as it was conducted, made an assumption about what is an appropriate fund balance to be retained in both of those funds, and that is similar to our general fund, which is 25% of our annual operating expenses. And it also set a target of an additional $2 million in the fund at all times in case of an emergency. So if there's an emergency that requires an immediate capital improvement or something like that, the rate study assumed that we would have a fund balance of above and beyond the 25% expenditures of an additional $2 million. And so as I presented the water and the wastewater long-range financial plan slides just a few moments ago, we are meeting that 25% target and the additional $2 million in the water enterprise. It's slipping a little bit below that for the wastewater enterprise in the 2021 and the 21-22 fiscal years, but it then does rebound after that. And so I believe the rates that are set are still appropriate for the planned operating and capital expenses in both enterprise funds at this time, particularly given that the rebounding is planned in the out years. And then there was also a couple comments and questions about the cable department and how they obtain and receive customer feedback and their social media presence. They do obtain customer feedback from surveys that they have. They have a SurveyMonkey format on their website, and they are also planning to improve their presence and expand their presence on social media in the upcoming fiscal year. So those were all of the action items that staff had noted from the retreat on May 29th.
And we're happy to take questions from council now on the operating budget before we go into the capital presentation, or we can do the capital presentation and take questions on everything afterwards. We're happy to handle it either way.
What does council wish to do? Continue on or stop for questions? Continue? Okay, continue. Please.
Okay, so now I'd like to provide an overview of the city's capital improvement program, or our CIP budget request for fiscal year 1920. So I'd first like to provide just a really high-level overview of our CIP budget in the current fiscal year, which is that first column. It's called our carryover appropriations. That is the budget that we plan to carry over from this current fiscal year into next fiscal year for planned expenditures. And then what our funding request is in fiscal year 1920. And then if you add those two columns together, that equals our total project funding in fiscal year 1920. And it shows a table of all major CIP programs for water, wastewater, stormwater, cable, our parks and facilities program, and we do have some capital projects in the police department, our streets division, and in technology. So the overall funding request that's being made in fiscal year 1920 is $6,822,243. Just $6,822,243. I should note here that there is a large negative number on the cable department, and I mentioned that at the May 29th hearing, is that we are planning to defund the fiber to the home project that was appropriated in the fiscal year 18-19 budget without any dedicated revenue at that time. And as I mentioned, staff, the city manager's budget proposes to defund that project and then bring it back to council when and if there is a dedicated revenue source to implement that project. And we would request both the revenue and the expenditure appropriation at that time. So I'd like to start with what are some of the recently completed projects in the CIP program. And during the operating year, staff does, on a regular basis, bring staff reports requesting City Council's approval of projects to be deemed complete. There are a number of projects in the fiscal year 1920 budget where we are identifying projects as complete. You'll see the San Mateo Avenue Water Project, the Spyglass Pump Station. There were a number of fiber to the home projects that the cable department implemented for the multi-dwelling unit projects for apartments in San Bruno. There was a civic center improvements projects that was completed for gardening and parking improvements outside of City Hall. The wood carving restoration project was related to the purchase and acquisition of the land for the Florida Park project. And that was already complete, the actual land and acquisition component of that project. And the picture on the bottom of this slide shows the wood carving that was found at the property that was acquired that is prominently displayed in City Hall. We are also proposing the completion of the Caltrain grade separation project. This project was actually completed by Caltrain back in 2012. And one of the main intents of that project was to eliminate rail safety hazards by elevating the tracks from the street level. And the city and the Caltrain agreed that the city would design and construct a decorative feature adjacent to the structure. This element will be evaluated as part of the downtown streetscape study that is currently underway. And that will also include additional signage for off-street parking, as well as some directional signage at key locations. Yes, go ahead.
And this action, it's a lot of money. It's $647,000. And the project was completed. It's essentially a recognition that a prior council decision that we would not spend money on the decorative arch where the cost kept escalating. And so the last cost estimate that I saw was over $1 million that the council said, you know what, we're not going to proceed. But the project remained open, and this $600,000 remained in the project. And so essentially we're closing out the project, returning the money back to the general fund capital reserve. So it's kind of a closeout and a final execution of that prior council decision.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. And just a clarification for these projects, they are completed and they were either done under budget or it was modified to where that money is being returned. That's what the idea of the defunded means. Okay. All right. That's all.
So for the adopted budget, we wanted to highlight the completion and the grand opening that occurred at the Earl Glenview Park. And so that the images of the opening of that park and what the park looked like and many of its features are on the cover of this year's fiscal year 1920 budget. This next slide is a list of projects that are regularly in our CIP program where there is additional funding to existing projects. And so we do have an annual project for our paving management program for street rehabilitation and slurry seal. And then also our sidewalk repair program. There's an annual project that we create in our CIP. And so I just wanted to highlight these as these are individual projects that we request funding for, but they really are for ongoing programs. So this is the annual, consider it the annual allocation into those programs that is being proposed. There are 6 new CIP projects in the city manager's proposed budget in fiscal year 1920. The first is for the Crestmore Canyon Slope Stability Project. There is a hillside erosion evaluation was recently conducted, and it did conclude that there was a high likelihood for future erosion, and the slope does need to be stabilized. Design is anticipated to be completed in fiscal year 1920, with construction following in the following year. There's a project for a regional stormwater capture project. This is an EPA grant-funded project, and it will evaluate stormwater capture in an open space in the Caltrans right-of-way between Interstate 280 and 380 interchange. And the construction of this project is listed in the unfunded priority section of the CIP. So this is just initial money to start the project, but there is no dedicated or known construction funding for this project at this time. Another project is for the city facilities door access and management system. This is a new project to implement a more modern, a more secure access to many of the city's facilities. And you'll see that there is no money in the fiscal year 1920 budget for it. We are programming to start that in the fiscal year 2021 budget cycle. There's a new project for dispatch and records ergonomic updates. This is with the police department, and it will be funded through the police department's equipment reserve and their asset forfeiture funds. And these are ergonomic improvements to integrate technology, cable management, structural integrity, and console management to more effectively use the police department staff's equipment. There's a new project for a strategic software needs assessment and upgrade. This is a project that will more comprehensively assess the business requirements of many of the city's software applications to develop a plan to implement new systems that meet the city's changing needs. This initial funding will be used to document business requirements and plan a market research, put together a RFP or a solicitation, and to conduct some vendor selection and a roadmap to implement software improvements and enhancements in the upcoming fiscal years. And then finally, there's another technology project for data security and disaster recovery, really to conduct an in-depth audit of the city's current security and disaster recovery technologies, and provide and implement recommendations on best practices to improve the city's systems. So that's an overview of the new CIP projects that are being proposed. So this next slide is a list of projects that are currently in the CIP budget that we are recommending to defund. I mentioned earlier regarding the fiber to the home project in the cable department. Again, there is no dedicated revenue for that project, so until that is the case, we are proposing to defund that project. The City Hall landscaping project. This project was originally scoped to convert landscaping into additional parking in the City Hall area. But due to storm drainage and underground utility upgrades that would be required in order to do so, the project is much too costly to move forward under the original scope as intended, so it's proposing to be defunded. There's also the city tree management project. This funding for tree management is now folded into the city's operating budget. So it's now under the park's operating budget. It's no longer a CIP budget. So we're not defunding the tree management program. It's just moving from capital to operating. The next project is Fireman's Hall. This is one of the city's oldest buildings and is in need of HVAC and many other repairs. These repairs are not currently planned in fiscal year 1920, as the city assesses all of its facilities needs to more comprehensively determine the scope timeline, and the budget for all of them. So until that is done, we were proposing to to defund this project. And then finally, the library generator. The generator was no longer working, and so in order to maintain the generator, city staff was able to wire the generator to the City Hall generator. Further investigation is being conducted on that temporary solution to make it more permanent. And so the generator replacement is no longer necessary, as they'll be able to leverage the City Hall's generator. Okay, so then moving forward, to look beyond fiscal year 1920 into the out years. Again, for the CIP, we do budget in a 5-year time horizon. You can see that there is still a substantial amount of budget that is planned to be requested in fiscal year 2021, primarily in the water and the wastewater enterprises, as we've talked about already, and then starting to slow down in fiscal year 2022 all the way through the plan year of 23-24. And again, we update this plan on an annual basis, and so as staff present the operating budget to you, we will also provide an annual update on any new or changes to existing projects in the city's CIP.
It's worth noting on here, the bulk of the $222 million are sewer and wastewater projects that are funded by the existing rate increases and the funds can handle. The other large amount in park and recreation is the $50 million aquatic and rec facility that is funded by the San Bruno Foundation. So that makes up the largest amount of the planned capital improvements over this time horizon.
Marty. Mike.
Just wanted to clarify, you said sewer and wastewater, so it's sewer, water, and wastewater?
Sorry.
Just want to make sure. If we can go
Water,
back one
water,
slide.
water and wastewater.
If we can go back one slide.
It's the first two lines, water and wastewater.
Got it. So in our CIP plan, we're budgeting $200,000 in 23-24 on water. That seems really low?
Right.
So it was my understanding we were on a path to replace all of our water mains. Is that reflective of proceeding with replacing our water mains?
Sure. Let me have the Public Works Director respond.
Director Tan?
Hi. Well, I think the number for 2023 to 24 needs to be revised. I'll take a look at it again. It's probably my mistake in putting in that number. But in regards to the replacement work, there are a lot of water main replacements that are being scheduled, and we're doing it in a systematic manner. Currently, right now, we have a project out to bid, which we're calling the Avenues 1-1, 1-2. It's about an $8 million project, replacement for water and sewer. The bids will be opened on the 21st of this month. And we have a bid opening next week, actually this week, pre-bid meeting this week. And additional water sewer replacement project it's under design right now. So there are multiple projects underway to replace the water and sewer system in the east side of El Camino.
Great, thank you for explaining that. And at some point, if we could have a percentage of our water mains that we have replaced as we were moving along, I think I might have asked about that last time, but it would be good to help explain to the public where we are on our quest to have a replaced water system.
Right.
Thank you.
Just to expound upon that, it's also worth noting that in the fiscal forecast that we provided, the fund balance in 23-24 is just over $12 million. And so in that final year, more projects could be funded. Currently, they're not planned now, but we would, again, as the director said, go back and make sure that we've captured all of the projects that we're planning for year 2023 in these numbers right now.
It's good to see that's a typo.
I'm not sure it's a typo. Based on the projects that are planned, we'll confirm the number, but more projects may be added as we get closer to 23-24, and the fund balance can handle it.
Okay.
So just to follow on the conversation, here's just a few pictures of some of the projects in the CIP that are water, wastewater, and stormwater related. It includes the replacement or enhancement of water mains, water pump stations, sewer mains, water tanks, water well rehabilitation projects, and also storm trash capture projects. So now I'd like to shift gears to talk about a number of projects that staff have included in the CIP budget that are currently underfunded. So this is a list of projects where there might be some preliminary or some more immediate funding that has been identified, but the substantial amount of funding that will be required to implement all of these projects has not been identified. And so just at a high level, this includes the Spyglass Drive storm drain project and the trash capture projects in the stormwater enterprise. You'll see a number of projects in parks and facilities regarding some improvements to City Hall at the main counter, some door access, the door access project, the Commodore Park improvement project, work on our fire station 52, and park pathways. There's a number of projects in the streets division for pedestrian ramps and improvements, and some pedestrian safety and traffic calming projects, as well as additional funding for sidewalk repair and street light pole replacement, and traffic signal rehabilitation projects. And then for technology needs for the city, the strategic software needs assessment that I spoke about earlier. The money that's being requested is just for the initial assessment work, but there is not identified funding for the actual replacement or enhancement of many of the applications that will likely be required, as well as the disaster recovery IT project as well. So there are a number of projects that have very minimal funding already allocated to them, or none at all. And this is the complete list of those projects in the CIP budget before you this evening. Okay, there's.
Marty.
So for the fire station 52, at some point, we earmarked some money to that. Is that 6 million plus this 8 million that we're looking at, or?
So on the fire station 52, to be clear, 6 million was not earmarked for that. What the city council approved in the current year budget, the 18-19 budget, was a 1 million allocation, and the out years included $6 million that could be allocated over several years. And so what was adopted and allocated was 1 million.
1 million of the 6.
1 million of the 6. The estimated replacement costs is around $8 million for that. That 1 million is to start the initial plan and schematic design for the replacement of Fire Station 52, and it's essentially seed money. We do not have the full amount to replace it, but we know it is a facility that is in need of replacing, and there have been funds allocated to start the process, and we plan to start that process. That is one of the key projects that will be led by the Parks and Facilities Manager position that is being requested in the proposed budget.
And one follow-up question, that the remaining 5 million is then in which reserve?
So the remaining 5 million is in the city's general facilities reserve fund. That money the balance on that fund is just over $5 million. And so if you were to use the entire balance of that fund on Fire Station 52, you would have no money left in that fund for any other projects.
Right.
And so essentially the replacement of Fire Station 52 right now has the allocation of $1 million for the initial money to proceed with design and investigation of what the replacement will be. And we do plan to look at both a full replacement or a substantial remodel with potentially some expansion. And so it's essentially the difference between tearing the building down and starting over, or doing some substantial improvements to the building through a full building remodel. But again, that is a project that has $1 million allocated, and that work will begin and will be led in part by the Parks and Facilities Manager position.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. In the unfunded section of the CIP budget, it does include a number of capital projects that the city anticipates or wants to articulate a need for in the upcoming number of years, sort of above and beyond the 5-year time horizon where we have known or planned expenditures in the CIP projects. It includes these projects here for a number of ADA improvements that would be required on many of the city's facilities. It also includes citywide paving for residential streets and roads. As we've mentioned in many occasions prior, in order to maintain the city's PCI index score, we'll need an additional $6 million annually each year, and we currently do not have enough or adequate resources to maintain, let alone improve our PCI score on our roads. It includes funding for Crestmore Canyon fire safety improvements and trails, a pedestrian bridge, funding for the San Mateo Avenue streetscape plan, the implementation of that, as well as street light replacements. And then beyond that, there are a number of facilities that are aging that would require either major renovation or complete replacement in the out years, including City Hall, the Fireman's Roof, Fire Station 51, the library. There are a number of other facilities and infrastructure on this list that are included in the plan.
Right. And we don't have to go through this list in totality. What we really wanted to do through the capital budget is break down some of our needs. And what you essentially see is that there are two categories. There's underfunded and then there's unfunded. Underfunded means that there are things that we're working on that have either prior allocations or recommended allocations, but we do not have the money identified to complete those projects, but they are important projects like the replacement of Fire Station 52, where there is seed money allocated to begin investigation. And then there are projects that we know we have no funding for. And so as a city, we have a lot of deferred maintenance needs, and we continue to make progress with the money that's allocated and the money that's available, but we know that there are significant needs that are left unmet, both those that we are making progress on that we're going to need to find a way to fund in the short term, and those that are unfunded in the long term. And that's the list that's before you, which is the unfunded, wholly unfunded capital needs that we've identified.
Okay, so that's the end of the CIP budget presentation. And then so there's a few other topics that are planned for discussion tonight before we start taking additional questions from council. The next section is to provide an overview of the proposed equipment and vehicle purchases in fiscal year 1920 for the city. And before I present the list of which is included in your budget binder before you, is I just wanted to provide just a little high-level overview of the mechanism that the city uses to fund equipment and vehicles. So for the general fund, so for departments that get their funding from the general fund, parks and facilities, police, fire, community and economic development, those functions, the city has an equipment reserve fund. And so the way that money gets put into the equipment reserve fund is through an annual allocation from each individual department's operating budget. So if you look in the police department's operating budget, there is an annual allocation that goes, and it's shown as an expense, taking money out of the budget and putting it into the equipment reserve fund. And the concept behind that is that, let's say you have a vehicle that you want to purchase for $100,000, and the useful life of that vehicle is 10 years. you should be making an annual allocation into the equipment reserve fund for $10,000 so that at the end of 10 years, you have accumulated enough money in the reserve fund so that you can make the purchase. It spreads the cost of the large one-time purchase over the useful life of the equipment or the vehicle. So that's how the city uses that equipment reserve fund. In total, the annual allocation going into that equipment reserve fund is just over $340,000. And the ending fund balance at the end of this current fiscal year is projected to be just around $4.2 million. This is an area, though, that there is pretty significant need. This is an underfunded need with the city, the funding for the timely and adequate replacement of our vehicles and our equipment. Through this budget process, I worked very closely with many department staff on developing a comprehensive inventory of all of their equipment and their vehicles for sustaining their operation. And we prepared a projection of what should be the annual allocation into that fund on an annual basis, and how much money should reside in that fund if we were to replace the equipment and the vehicles on the optimal time frame. And at the conclusion of doing that analysis, the current balance in the fund of around $4.2 million, it only represents 64% of what should be in the fund at this time. So the fund itself is currently underfunded. And if you were to look at the annual allocation going into the fund to make sure that it is maintained, the annual allocation only represents 38% of what it should be. So the ongoing funding of the city's vehicles and equipment is significantly underfunded as of right now. And so what's before you in the fiscal year 1920 proposed budget is not what it should be based on the optimal replacement schedule for many of these vehicles and equipment, but it's what is needed to replace many of the vehicles and equipment that are in dire need of replacement.
And so one of the questions is, well, if the fund is underfunded, why are we not increasing the allocations to this fund? Well, while some funds can handle the increased allocation, the majority cannot. And so it's really our general fund vehicles that are underfunded. And so increasing that allocation right now would increase our deficit. And so we have decided to hold that allocation essentially at status quo with this budget year. And that is another fiscal challenge that we face. In addition to overcoming some of our other challenges is making sure that we are funding our equipment reserve at the appropriate level, so when things need to be replaced, there's enough money in the fund and we're not pulling from other sources to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. And just a follow-on that, there are a few next steps that I wanted to bring to Council's attention of something that we'll be reviewing shortly after the budget is adopted. We'll be looking at whether or not we should have separate accounting for the planned equipment and vehicle purchases in our enterprise funds. We don't currently have an equivalent equipment reserve fund for our enterprise funds. The equipment reserve fund is only for our general fund. And so we'll be working with water and wastewater and stormwater and cable and on seeing if we can do that for them as well. And the work in reviewing our equipment and vehicles is a major component of the comprehensive fiscal sustainability project, which the city manager and I have been talking about over the past number of months.
Yeah. And the first bullet up there under next steps talks about separating out the equipment, furniture, and vehicles. And in our review, one of the things that we found is that the city does not have what's typically referred to as an FF&E, fixtures, furniture, and equipment. It oftentimes goes unnoticed, but when you calculate all the tables and chairs and furniture that the city has that needs to be replaced, most cities allocate a separate reserve for that, and they call it an FF&E, of fixtures, furniture, and equipment. We do not have one. When those things need to be replaced, they either come from directly an allocation from the general fund, or they're pulled from this equipment reserve where the allocations that go into the fund are really to fund our heavy equipment and our vehicles. And so again, you're pulling from money that was intended for one purpose. And so one of the strategies that we would like to look at is over time set up an FF&E So you separate out those fixtures, furnitures, and equipment that may seem small individual, but when you total up all of the FF&E that we have citywide, it's quite a large number. And when things need to be replaced, the best practice is having a reserve fund to go to replace them that you're contributing to over a long period of time, the lifespan of the asset, versus having one large allocation when things are needed. And so, again, it's a challenge that we need to address that we don't have funds to address right now, but we at least, again, part of the fiscal sustainability project was to understand our challenge and be very transparent about that. And this is just one prong of that.
So with that, the city is requesting in its proposed fiscal year 1920 budget just over $666,000 worth of equipment and vehicle requests. There was a late change in one of the equipment requests in the Parks Department that is being made on the slide here. That will be included in the adopted budget, but it's not currently in the budget binder that you have before you. There is a request for $17,550 to replace the lights and the ballasts in Diamond 1 and Diamond 2 in City Park. These fields are used nightly for different sporting events, and the lights play a really significant role in ensuring that play is very safe there. And so we wanted to include this request for the Parks Department using their equipment reserve money. It's $17,550. Okay, and so with that, the last section of the budget presentation is to review debt service, or our debt portfolio. So I just wanted to provide a really brief overview. The city has historically and very strategically issued debt to fund critical capital projects. Recent examples have been the water and the wastewater bonds that were issued in 2017 to advance the enterprise capital projects to sustain and improve that infrastructure. Issuing debt is a very common practice for municipalities. It's similar to a homeowner taking out a mortgage on their home. It allows the city to advance projects more quickly, take advantage of the strong economic factors, and pay the costs over a period of time so that citizens can experience and realize those capital improvements more immediately and pay the cost over a period of time. The city does have a debt management policy that council adopted back in 2017, and that is our guiding principles, our guiding document when issuing new debt or exploring the potential refinancing of some of our existing debt. You can see these first few bullets here are the major components of our debt management policy and what some of our recent debt transactions have been. I was able to find a Census Bureau study that was done a number of years ago of the 81 most populous cities in the country, and only just over 23% of them had a AAA bond rating by S&P. And it's a great accomplishment that San Bruno does have a AAA bond rating. And there are a number of factors as to why that is. We have a very high degree of creditworthiness. We pay our bills on time. We have very strong conservative financial management and budgetary policies and practices. And so there are a number of reasons why we have been able to attain and continue to achieve a AAA credit rating. And one of our recent debt transactions was the refinancing of the debt that we had on the police headquarters building that council approved of us doing just a few months ago. We were able to get a really high credit rating on that transaction with a number of the factors noted here, and we got a very, very favorable interest rate, and we're able to refinance with a significant amount of savings on that debt. There are a few benchmark metrics that the financial industry looks at when considering the health and the overall burden of the city's budget on how much debt we might have. And so there are a number of metrics that are out there, and I wanted to present to council the health of our debt portfolio as it relates to our overall budget. And I'll just review a couple of these. One of the metrics that is reviewed is our debt level, and one of the key targets is if the city's debt, the total amount of debt that they have, is less than $2,000 per capita, so $2,000 per population, then that's considered more healthy. And our debt level per capita is just over $346, so significantly lower than the target, which is a really good sign. Another example, which is that third one down, is what's our debt service burden? And if our debt service is less than 8% of our total general fund expenditures, that is considered very healthy. And our debt burden is just over 4%. Again, that's an extremely healthy metric when looking at our debt portfolio. And actually, all of these industry standard metrics are all positive for San Bruno. And so the summary I'd like to convey to council here is that we have a very strong debt portfolio. We have budgeted all of the required annual debt payments that we must make on the debt that we do have in our fiscal year 19-20 budget. We will make them as we've made in prior years. And there is capacity when looking at these metrics to take on additional debt burden if we needed to do so. Right now in the 19-20 budget, we are not planning on issuing any new debt, but I will continue to monitor interest rates to see if it would be opportune for us to refinance some of our existing debt, as I did with recently with the police facility. Do you want to do the closing?
All right. So before we take council questions, in closing, what have we said both tonight and in May at our full budget retreat on May 29th? Essentially what we said is the city's budget is stable, but it's not sustainable. We have needs as an organization. The city is over 100 years old, and a number of our assets require maintenance that is above our ability to maintain them. That is not atypical. Cuts will impact our ability to provide service, and so this budget, there's good news in it. I know we just went through the capital budgeting, and we went over a lot of our underfunded and unfunded projects, and that's not all good news, but there is good news in this budget. It begins with the sound practices that happened in the current fiscal year 18-19 to take an amended budget deficit of $2 million and through salary savings and some expenditure controls to really bring that into a positive at the end of this year. And so the projection is that we would end the year with a little over $200,000 in revenue over expenditures for the operating budget. The other good news is that that projected deficit is down to $347,000 in the proposed budget that is before you. The other good news is that the budget makes progress on a number of the city council priority focus areas, and while we do have fiscal constraints, we are continuing to make progress on your priorities and on your initiatives. And there are a number of them in there that we went through in February, and some that you added, and we continue to make progress even with our fiscal constraints. We currently still have steady revenue growth, and a large part of why we were able to accomplish the reduction in the deficit is revenue going up by 8%, but keeping the expenditure growth to 5%. So that delta really helped us eat away at that deficit. In the proposed budget, there are some enhancements. Understand that the enhancements go towards providing additional services to the community, but also providing services that are needed, such as the mechanic position and the parks and building maintenance manager position, to continue to make progress on some of the funded projects that we have and some of the needed annual maintenance needs that we have with some of our buildings. We do have significant deferred capital maintenance in just about every area, and we want to continue to work on that through the city's fiscal sustainability project. And we have had conversations about additional revenue options. We made a number of progress. I won't go through all of the accomplishments that we've done so far, in controlling the expenditures in the cable department or the other departments, but we have made a lot of progress this year that I think the city council and the organization should be proud of. And our reserves have largely been met, and that's a good thing. We have reserves in the bank to protect this community if something happens. And so I want to just thank staff for everything they did and all of their hard work in putting together this budget, the long hours that it took to prepare for not only putting the proposed budget together, but that May 29th all-day work session on the operating budget. And I hope you saw through that the dedication that all of your department team has and the work that everyone has put in to put a budget before you that we really think reflects the organization's needs. And we are here to answer any questions and work towards the adoption of the budget on June 25th.
Okay, let's bring it to council for questions in regards to the presentation on the operating, on the variety of things that we went over tonight. But I think staff is looking for any additional information that they might need to get back to us before the next meeting, in addition to ask any more detailed questions. If there's any concerns in the areas or items that you want to have expressed so that the staff is prepared and knows about it ahead of time. So with that, I'll open it up to council.
I'll wait. Go ahead.
The chair will call on Mr. Salazar.
So I said it before, but again, I really appreciate all the work that went into this process. I know it is a lot of work, and with so many new people digging into this, I know it was especially challenging, and you guys rose to the occasion, so very happy with what you guys put together. It seems to me that we are so close to just eliminating any structural deficit, and actually, I think in my entire history here, getting to the point where we have a budget that actually we're living within our means. And I'm just wondering if we couldn't go back and sharpen those pencils just a little bit more and come back with something that says, here's what we need to do our jobs, here's what we need to do what you set us out to do, and we can actually do it within the budget that we expect to come in. Is that a reality?
City Manager.
Absolutely. We can always go back and look at the budget and find areas to cut. There are, what I would say, a status quo is a cut, and a lot of our departments really held their budget line items to existing levels and didn't do things that they've put off for a number of years. We didn't review each of the enhancements today, but we can pull that up and go through them and have those conversations. But if the city council wishes to direct us to go back and find avenues to cut, we absolutely will do that. We will take your direction.
And, you know, I've always felt that our role up here is not to dig in and, like I said, basically give you a goal and then basically cut you off at the knees and still tell you to go do it. So, I mean, I don't know that there's anything in there that I would say pull this one out because this is the one that's least important to me. I'm really going to rely on staff's understanding of the process and the unintended consequences of making one change in one area and not in another. So I don't claim to have the knowledge or the technical, those little details that would say, you know, this is the one that I don't want. I'm going to rely on staff's understanding of the necessities, and I'll stand behind those. If you tell me that you absolutely need to have those, I will stand behind them. In the past, I've said no improvements. We're going to balance one way or another, and I've largely been overruled. But I really feel that you have gone back and really dug as deep as you can. So there's no one thing that I'm going to say, pull that one out and make it balance. I'm just asking if there's any way to go back and you can get us to, basically nirvana, then, I would ask that we look again, maybe have just one more look, find if there's one thing that we can change. But I really want that to come from staff, because I don't want to sell any one department short, and I don't want to sell staff short on, having what you need to get the job done. I mean, my role up here, I feel, is to give you what you need, and I'm not going to, claim to be any better at any one of your jobs than you are. So I'll leave it at that.
Fair. Okay, thank you. Mr. Medina. Or Marty, sorry.
It's fine. No, it's all good. I share Councilman Salazar's, I guess, overall interest in having a balanced budget. I know it's a very extremely difficult thing to do. In our report, or in your report, it is status quo, but it's a 5% increase on page A5 of $2 million in additional expenditures, right? So with that in mind, I think I'm at that age now where I'm becoming more and more conservative, and I want to see that balance. I am not going to say that I don't appreciate all the work that's gone into getting us here, and yet I think it's important as we're facing these problems with a different set of eyes, which is truly appreciated, because in order to move this city forward and to be able to have better streets, better infrastructure, we're going to have to make some tough choices. And this choice of we're 0.75% of the $50+ million of needing to get to a balanced budget. If you add up the $350 million, right, of the general fund budget. So I'm not sure, well, I'll leave it at that. In years past, we kind of went through the requested enhancements, and I don't know what the direction or our preference from our council is going to be this year, if we're going to do that at a later time. I did want to ask and suggest one thing about the lights for Diamond 1 and Diamond 2. The San Bruno Lions have been pursuing and willing to remodel the interior of the concession stand for Tom Lara Field, and I needed to remind to put that in that request, that in doing so, it was determined, or maybe you could tell me a little bit more about what staff has done since the Lions have brought forth this project kind of unexpectedly, yet if you could share with the council what those intentions are and the potential for a grant, and to include that $17,500 with that grant for Measure K funding from the county.
Sure.
Thank you.
So the Lions concession stand project came about by the San Bruno Lions receiving a $25,000 grant from the San Bruno Community Foundation to do improvements at the concession stands. We, of course, want to facilitate community groups that want to improve their community, and they had some money from the foundation to do it. It wasn't an adopted capital project, but we said, you know what, let's see, can we facilitate the project? Well, sort of not atypical of some of our other infrastructure. Once we really got into it, it turned out to be an additional $150,000 project that was needed. In order to improve the concession stands, you need to make the area watertight, which means improving the roof, which means taking off the bleachers, which means some concrete work, some water sealing work, which means likely replacing the windows on the grandstand. And so the price tag went up, and essentially the Lions had a wonderful volunteer project, and with their in-kind contributions and the foundation, they could do a nice job remodeling the interior of the concession stands. But in order to make that investment worthwhile, we need to make other improvements. So the total price tag is roughly about $150,000, give or take. I do know that a number of council members have reached out to supervisors, Canapa and Pine, and will be pursuing grant opportunities with them. So I think what you're requesting is for the city to include an allocation of $25,000 to help support this project. And if that is a request you're asking us to make in the budget, we can do that. I would ask where you would like that money to come from, because what I also heard is reduce the budget by roughly $347,000 to be even and add additional $25K. So are we reducing by 370 some odd thousand?
I think the intent, or my intent, was to offer that project, and there's other ones that I wanted to just clarify. Like, for instance, we talked about the agenda management system of being $30,000, so that would be added onto a project, right? We talked about the fire, and that was my next question to you, would be with the fire, but it's all kind of related, right? So what we're going to do about fire mitigation, and the number I heard is estimated at $200,000, but what would we allocate to put in the budget? Is it kind of as we waiting for prices, or we have to have something there? I think that's how we prefer to have a budget to know what we're expecting to do in the year. So I need a little clarification on that.
Fair, and thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to have the fire chief get up to talk about what we're doing about fire mitigation. And while he's coming up, I'll talk about the financial piece. And so the fire mitigation in the canyon, making progress on that will be above the city manager's signature authority of $75,000. And so we need to get proposals and bring those contracts to the city council for approval. And so we could do an estimate in the budget, or when we bring the contract to you, we can bring the allocation request and the contract and not lose any time. And so I don't think it's something that has to be in the budget right now. There are a number of different avenues that the fire chief will talk about that may impact the dollar amount that it costs. And so the approach that we're taking in this budget is to not include an estimated allocation, but instead to come back to council for an allocation request once we know the direction in which we're going. And so the question is, how will we fund that? That likely will come from fund balance or another pot of money. And so if we include that, that will increase that deficit number. At this point, it is likely something that we need to do no matter what. And so my recommendation is that we keep progressing with getting the quotes and bring them to council at one time for allocation. But I'll let the fire chief talk about where we are in that process.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. The city manager did a very good job earlier kind of giving a summary, but I can add a little to it. So as you recall, we came in to you in January for approval for the assessment, for the risk assessment. So that's moving along quite well. Late May, we met with, if you recall, the other cities involved to the south of us, San Mateo, Central County, and Belmont, and Millbrae are also participating in the same process, because we're looking at, with fire mitigation, you want to look out across your borders. And so they did the fuel modeling. All the fuel modeling stuff looks accurate, so they're now putting all that data into that no-harm plan, and we should be getting that fairly shortly. But we knew that the canyon is an issue, right? We didn't need this report to tell us that. So what we've been doing, as you recall, very aggressively seeking grant opportunities. So we were successful with one grant. We got the around $16,000 to do some mitigation around the roadways, which we did in January. And then we submitted a grant application for a CAL FIRE grant that unfortunately we just learned at the end of April that we were unsuccessful in getting. But while we were working on those grants, we obviously did some work to kind of get us an idea of what kind of work we need to do. And so we've identified some additional work we'd like to do around the roadways in the canyon to kind of go a little farther off that path that we started, and then some clearing and defensible space around the homes around the canyon. So those are those kind of ballpark numbers we have that's where we kind of come up with that $200,000. So there's different ways to do that. We've talked about one way, very cost-efficient way, is to use CAL FIRE resources, basically hand crews that come in and do that work. And so we applied in May. Actually in March, we applied for that process. And so we are on the waiting list with CAL FIRE to come out and evaluate our site. They're very backed up. Obviously, there's a lot of projects throughout the county as well as the state. So in March, they told us around August they'll come out, review our site, and then we'll get in the pipeline to be able to use those crews. We've also sent staff to train so that if we do get those crews approval, we'll have staff on. That's part of the requirement, that there's staff that can sit by and watch those crews and oversee that work. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at now as far as stuff that would be kind of ready to go in the canyon.
Marty? Thank you.
Thank you for that. As for getting our residents a little bit more prepared to do things around their own home, about how to clean the gutters and kind of getting some of that community outreach of just standard fire safety, is that also an element of this process, or?
It certainly is. We've done that in the past. We used our open house to do that on the last 2 years in October. We've also, the fire marshal has periodically put information out on Nextdoor about defensible space and kind of fire prevention issues and stuff like that. We can certainly do that periodically. Again, as we go forward, we use our social media for that as well.
All right, so thank you for that information, and I'll still want to see that return and see if you can sharpen those pencils a little bit, and with the understanding that at some time in the future, when you have the cost determined, and that you would be coming back to us and we would have to find the funding for that mitigation in not only in Crestmore Canyon, right? These are our additional open spaces along Trenton, over in our other open spaces. This is what that assessment was
Correct. The assessment is really going to give us those ideas of where we face risk and where we should prioritize that work. We've moved forward with the canyon because we know that's a risk. The plan will really kind of allow us to bring projects forward to you that are based on needs.
Just to clarify, before we go to the Vice Mayor, so what I'm hearing is potentially, as we know, staff has been working on a proposal for Measure K funding from our two supervisors, Pine and Canapa, and I think they are getting close to the end of having that able, so that can be presented in addition to the foundation. So what I'm hearing you say then, Marty, is to have maybe $25,000 placed within the budget for the concession booth project in case of Measure K funds don't meet it, or in case there has to be some type of, shall we say, skin in the game and having to make some contribution. I'm also hearing from staff that another additional $17,550 from the finance director, which isn't currently in here, is being asked to be here for Lara Field and Diamond 2 lights, which would, if I'm good, let me keep going. Am I correct?
The request for the lights and the ballast at Diamond 1 and Diamond 2 is using the equipment reserve fund. And so it would not impact the general fund balance per se. It would be drawn out from the equipment reserve fund.
Okay, and then as was indicated too, not that it's in the budget, potential management or for council packets at 30,000. I know we've talked about fire mitigation. There's only one of two methodologies that I could think of. One is allocating 75,000, which the city manager has discretion up to if there was some urgent matter, or continue to go down the path, which was to find out through the assessment process, which we have this Crestmore Canyon is the biggest concern for the community at this point. Every area is important, but that has come up as its biggest. So city manager is recommending that it come back to us on the generator at fire that operates the fire station and city hall, which now has been tied into the library. Can it operate all three facilities simultaneously, and for how long, if needed?
Yeah, I do not have that answer for you right now. I know that when that project was done, an analysis was done that the city hall generator could power the library in an outage. That has been tested. We, in the last 10 months that I've been here, I think I can count 2 outages that we've had where it did power the critical systems for City Hall and the library. And so those systems appear to be working. If what you're asking for is that detailed analysis on the load that was done for that generator, we can provide that. But I can, the library is currently patched in to the City Hall generator, and it's working, and the wires are there, and I think we've all seen them as we traverse.
That's good. Okay, then there was just a comment, then I'll turn over to the Vice Mayor, and I had one other thing, is just on Fire Station 52, I know that the $6 million in my memory was somewhat placed in hold, I'll call it, for that task and project. Fair statement, out of that, $1 million has been to begin the project or the scope or to look at it. But the $5 million still stays in the reserve. But in my mind, from the past, it had not been to say that $5 million, I'm not saying in an emergency, but I'm saying that could be taken for this or that. I think back then it was a different council, but my memory, I have to go back in notes, was the premise from that, which was monies were received from a settlement. So that's just for information that can be looked at later. And then Vice Mayor.
Thank you. I'd too like to thank staff. I know putting a budget together this complex and this large and distilling it down so that we can understand it and the public can understand it is not an easy task. So I thank you very much for that. I would love a balanced budget, but I know that you've already sharpened your pencils over and over again. So I'm fine with the $300,000 structural deficit. I believe that by the end of the year we'll be fine. So I'm not worried about that. And partly because we as a city have the, I'll say, unfortunate habit of putting Band-Aids on things that we should fix right away, or we delay, defer, not even improvements, just maintenance sometimes. And ultimately what happens is it costs more. And the snack bar at Lara Field is a perfect example. I used to run back and forth from the swimming pool to that snack bar in the 70s, and it was not great then. So and hasn't been improved since. And what would have been a nice little project at $25,000 is now, not suddenly, but it is $150,000 to get even a decent, not even a frilly kind of snack bar, just to get a plain old safe place. So we do that occasionally. It's not something I would recommend doing continuously, and I know that this budget has some things in it that we are looking at to fix now before they get even more expensive to fix later. So I think that's fine. I encourage us to look at keep going with the Measure K grant money. I hope that comes through for us. If it doesn't, I think we need to start allocating money right away. So if, I don't know, I don't even think $25,000 would do it. I think the $75,000 to start, because the sooner you do it, the faster you do it, the less it costs to do it, and then the less it costs to maintain it. So I'm fine with the $300,000, and I think we need to do the fire suppression, fire prevention piece of it.
And to get back to some of the questions that were which were asked, so as in the past, I've asked for a continuing resolution to be also brought to council, so that should something not be approved within the budget, that obviously the city still continues to operate on July 1. Also, council can take it in different pieces if they want to do the operating budget, and if they want to do enhancements, that can be done. I think on the enhancements area, I think you've given comment, but if council members have additional questions or have thoughts, I think that you'd want to hear from that sooner than later, or at least be able to get back that information. I do want to say too, on this budget, the budget is different than I have dealt with before, and this, which was fine. There is nothing wrong with change. There's nothing wrong with doing it different and moving it forward. So I think what I do realize is that it saved a lot of time as far as duplicating efforts, as far as it's already within the system rather than duplicating it in two different locations. I think that was positive. What I also think was positive is that when we truly look at this particular budget, where I don't believe it was as clear as it is today, is that it showed also the true operating. So it showed it with the enhancements included, where it sometimes in the past, those enhancements were not included to have the overall total number. And therefore, this gives a true representation for the council, who are not accountants, as well as the general public, what dollars we're truly talking. So I like that improvement and that change to the system. And I do know that you did spend a lot of time, and like I've said before, it wasn't just about, so what did we do before? It was about analyzing the line items and the budget and the usage. It also was a compliment to staff that have narrowed the deficit to what it is. It's in the budget projected at 273, but it's not done. And so anything, it could be zero. So we don't know it until it's the end and we have the audit. But the point of it is it goes to actually watching each line item and being very conscientious through that process to the end. And I think that staff, and that's with those that are here, those that are out in the field, and those that are in the different divisions that have made that concerted effort. In addition, it didn't hurt that we've had, about $1 million more in property tax. So that also helped to balance. But it also was a lot with staff as well. With that said, I also am one that, and I don't think it's because I'm getting older or more mature, but I've always been kind of this way with the budget. But I do think I would like to see, again, a deficit is just that. Doesn't mean that I have the silver lining and all the answers, but I also share a little bit of the same of seeing what can be done or what could be done. Because even if we add fire mitigation, even if we add the 30,000, even if we add the 25,000, the deficit has now grown. So it's again, having to still make tough choices. And, we can't predict the future. I think we're down the path, and so I do want to thank staff for their time and their effort. Sorry. Michael, clarification.
In addition to what I said before, I guess if there's one area in this budget where I know that you guys could probably cut and it wouldn't really impact anything else is the part that is the city council's budget. And I know that 30,000 was already removed and put into the city managers that used to cover publishing for the newsletter. In past, I know that we've cut the number of issues that we put out to help with that. I'm thinking if printing and postage is that huge, that maybe we should, and I know we've given you direction otherwise where we want to do more mailings, we want to do more outreach, but if postage and printing is killing us on a lot of these things, I'm wondering if we really could just focus a lot more on electronic channels to get messages out. I don't know that a lot of people are really looking at these paper copies that we sent out. We're creating a lot more garbage, and then now we don't have anywhere to put our recycling anymore. So we're actually creating a problem, and possibly not even helping to get any real information out. So I know that we've gotten a lot better with our social media, and I think that's an area where we can maybe focus a little bit more. It's almost free to do some of those communications, what we do with email. I think we were really successful with the texting campaign that we did for the survey. So we've proven that there are some channels out there that we can tap into. We can push a little more into those, and it looks like there are some considerable savings in that. And so I know that there might be a little bit more that we could give back. I gave back my city-issued iPad. I felt that was an unnecessary expense. It was, the cellular charges on that and the cost of the device itself, I felt were, and I think Marty did the same thing. If there's anything else in here that we could give up, I'm sure that we'd be willing to consider maybe not going to as many conferences or cutting out some publications. So if there's something there something more that we could give back, I'd volunteer to start there, and let's, lead by example. That's it.
If I can do a quick recap. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I understand about social media, and I agree with you that we need to do more on that. But on the other hand, there are many people who do not pay attention to social media. A lot of people I know don't even have internet, and they rely on the printed pieces of paper. I know, and unfortunately, we can't weed them out. We can't say, okay, you 5,000, you get printed, and the rest of you get electronic. So I would hesitate to take all of it away, maybe half, or look at it somehow, but to not have mail anything, I really hesitate to do that.
Yeah, and I agree. We probably don't want to just cut it off at the knees, but maybe we need to look at some kind of an opt-in process so that people that do want it can sign up for it. And we're getting more and more people to sign up for email notifications. I know our city clerk has been really successful in getting traction behind that. So if we could, maybe do some outreach and get people that want printed media to sign up for it, and then we know who they are and we know we're not wasting it, then maybe that's a better approach.
Marty.
Thank you. Just going back to the presentation on the underfunded and the unfunded projects, if you could possibly prepare a spreadsheet that lists what those numbers really are, page 41, 42, and 44 and 45, I think that'll help understand the full problem of our underfunded situation.
Anything
That
else from city manager?
spreadsheet is there. It's on page 400 in the fully adopted budget. There's a section on underfunded projects. We provided the high-level summary here. Just as a quick recap, so we've heard a number of things. One was an additional $25,000 for the Tom Lahr Field. I think we can accomplish that by use of the general fund capital reserve. The reserve policy is $5 million, and the projected ending is 5.36, so we can pull the 25 from there. In regard to the $17,000 for the lights at Diamond 3, that is proposed to come from the equipment reserve.
Layer 1 and
I'm sorry. Is
Diamond
it
2.
Layer 1 and Layer 2?
17,550.
1 and 2. Okay, so sorry, 1 and 2.
Sure.
I just want to be clear. So what we're hearing from council is to go back and essentially make reductions in the proposed budget such that revenue is balanced with expenditures, and that's roughly cutting $376,000 from the budget. I want to point out what that will do is our general fund reserve policy limit for fund balance is $1.5 million. The budget at the ending 18-19 is projected to be $2.44. If we remove that $376,000, the deficit spending, it would come from that line item. And so At $2 million, the ending fund balance, we're already $500,000 over the policy limit. And so by adding back that $376,000, we'll be just over $900,000 over the policy limit. But that is the direction we're hearing, is to look for ways to remove the deficit amount of $376,000.
I'm going to clarify, and council can correct me. I think what you heard from council was, from maybe 2 to 3 of us, that was, if you could go back and you can look at it and potentially sharpen the pencil, the ideal world would be 0. But there are things that, as Mr. Salazar said, that he doesn't have the immediate answer. He gave you a suggestion here on the council aspect. I think with the vice mayor, she had felt that it was sound and was supportive. I think I'm going to believe that Marty and I were ones that are saying, yes, can we decrease that deficit? And I understand not everything can go. There's something that I know was $6,000. Doesn't seem like a lot, but the importance of it within the finance department is critical, and I get that. So there are things we can't do to also open risk and liability for the city either. Is that fair, council? Well, I think I articulated yours correct. Okay.
Okay. Before we go on, I have one other suggestion, and I don't know how easy or hard it is to do, but I recently received an email from somebody who was complaining about the work ethic or effort, I should say, that he used to observe in 1986 and how it is different now. And he was not comparing them favorably, and I was trying to figure out some of the differences, and just right off the bat, the population is from 1988 to now is quite a bit different, and our full-time employee equivalent per 1,000 residents, or 10, I forget what measurement, I think it's 1,000 residents, from then to now is quite a bit different. So while plus the things that we have to do are exponentially more difficult. We have more state mandates. We have the budget. I have a copy of a budget from 1978 that's this big, both capital and regular general fund budget. And you compare it to what we have now, it's just ridiculous. But he wanted the same service that he got then now. So anyway, the bottom line is it worthwhile showing the census from 1980 to 2010, I think those are the two things, the change in population and the change in how many people we had employed then and how many we employ now and what the ratio is. Just at the very front.
Well, that sounds familiar. I think somebody else asked about what the employee level was 10 years ago versus today.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So I think that would be enlightening for some people. Okay, thank you.
Okay. We do have a closed session, but I'm going to ask council to convene that, and it should be short, I understand, and it will be at the end of the meeting because we have a 7 o'clock. I'm also need to announce that in the parking lot there is a white Nissan. Is that right, Melissa? In the parking lot with the lights that are on. So, don't want to be able not to go home tonight. So, with that, we're going to go ahead and adjourn the special meeting, and we will be starting the regular meeting within about 5 minutes.